Billionaire CEO secretly follows his maid. What he discovers about her triplets leaves him frozen. Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and I hope you're doing well today. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know in the comments below. Now listen. YouTube doesn't always show you our newest stories unless you search for us directly. So if you're truly part of this storytelling family, type Beyond Color Stories in the search bar and never miss a tale again. And today's story? Whew, it's not just a love story. It's a storm, a truth, a kiss that rewrites everything. But I won't spoil it. Just promise me one thing. Stay until the very end. Because trust me, that ending, you'll feel it in your soul. The Carrington mansion, nestled on the farthest edge of Black Ridge Hills, stood like a monument to wealth. Elegant, sharp, untouched by time or trouble. Every corner gleamed with luxury, marble floors cold under your soles, gold-framed portraits of long-forgotten ancestors, chandeliers that looked more like galaxies hanging above the silence. The air inside never changed. It was always still, perfectly perfumed, and strangely lonely. That was where Soraya Belrose worked, moving quietly through the halls like a secret the house itself kept hidden. She wasn't loud, wasn't the kind of person to draw attention, but there was a presence about her, a delicate energy, like a candle flickering in a windless room. She didn't need to speak for people to feel her. The staff whispered about her sometimes, not out of meanness, but out of curiosity. She didn't laugh much, she didn't complain. She simply arrived, worked harder than anyone else, and left as if the world owed her nothing. She moved as though she was carrying something heavy inside her, but it wasn't bitterness. It was something softer, a history she kept locked behind her wide, honey-dark eyes. Zayden Carrington, the master of the mansion, was not the kind of man to notice his maids. He was 34, sharp-jawed, clean-suited, commanding in every sense. His time was too precious for pleasantries, too consumed with mergers, investments, and empire building. He walked like a man who had never been questioned and spoke like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. People listened because they were afraid not to. And yet, on that particular morning, something disrupted his routine. He had just stepped into the sunroom to grab his forgotten tablet when he heard it. A voice, soft, almost like a hum, echoing gently off the marble. He paused, frowning. No one was supposed to be in that room this early. He rounded the corner and saw her. Soraya. She stood by the tall window, sunlight pouring around her like liquid gold. Her back was to him, and her fingers moved in careful circles over the glass pane as she cleaned. But what held him wasn't the task, it was the song, a sad, wordless melody. She hummed it under her breath, unaware of her audience, and it struck something dormant in him, something fragile. Her voice wasn't polished, it was raw, honest, the kind of sound that wrapped around your bones and refused to let go. He should have left, should have walked away silently like he always did. But he stood there, hidden behind the archway, watching her for a long minute. When she turned slightly, her profile caught the light. Her skin glowed with warmth, her lashes thick and lowered as she concentrated on her task. On the nearby bench sat a small plush dinosaur, left behind by a guest's child the night before. She picked it up with care, her lips curving into a smile that looked so out of place in this cold mansion. Not because it was wrong, but because it was rare. She tucked the toy into a little satchel she carried and whispered something to herself. Zayden didn't hear it, but whatever it was, it made her eyes look even sadder. And that, for reasons he couldn't explain, made his chest ache. She moved on, disappearing down the hallway without ever knowing he had been there. That was the first time he truly saw her. Not just the uniform, not just the label of maid, but the woman. And after that morning, he started noticing her more. It wasn't intentional at first. It began with glimpses, a flash of her braid slipping over her shoulder as she turned a corner, the soft swish of her skirt in the hallway, the faint scent of rose and lemon that lingered in the room moments after she left. Zayden began lingering near the kitchens during the early morning when she arrived. He told himself it was coincidence, told himself he was just grabbing coffee before his meetings. But every time their eyes met, she nodded politely and looked away, never holding his gaze long, never giving him more than was necessary, and that intrigued him. She was unlike anyone else in his world. The women he knew were loud, decorated in designer perfume, fluent in flirtation and ambition. They sparkled at events, clung to his arm, smiled with practiced ease. But Soraya was untouched by that world, grounded, gentle, and entirely uninterested in him. That puzzled Zayden. It also, unknowingly, began to pull him in. He watched the way the children of guests would cling to her legs, how the older staff would smile at her like she was the only bit of softness in this fortress of ice. She was respected but distanced, admired but kept apart, and she seemed to prefer it that way. Zayden noticed how she would often pause in front of windows just to look out. Not for long, just enough to remind herself that something existed beyond the stone walls. One afternoon, as he passed the West Wing hallway, he heard her laughing. Not the low hum. A real laugh, short and surprised. He peeked around the corner. She was talking to the gardener's little daughter, who had snuck inside looking for cookies. The child offered her a crumpled drawing. Soraya bent down and accepted it like it was fine art, praising every color. Zayden leaned against the wall, smiling before he could stop himself. But the second she sensed someone behind her, Soraya straightened, her joy vanishing into polite neutrality. When she saw it was him, she nodded. "Sir," she said, eyes cast down. And he hated that she folded herself into formality just because he walked into the room. He wanted to say something, to keep her smiling. But the moment passed, and so did she. His staff warned him, not directly, they wouldn't dare, but in careful murmurs. "She's just the help, sir," said his assistant once, catching Zayden watching Soraya as she arranged flowers. "Don't mix business with softness." Softness. That word sat with him all day. Was that what she was? Soft? Or was she stronger than any of them? Strong enough to carry whatever sadness lived behind her smile? Zayden found himself assigning tasks near her, asking her questions that didn't need answers, commenting on things just to see if she'd respond. Most times, she didn't. But on the rare occasion that she did, her voice was warm, measured, musical. And when she smiled, really smiled, it felt like sunlight broke into the coldest parts of his mansion. Then came the day that disrupted his routine entirely. It was a Thursday, a quiet day. He had just returned from a board meeting, his mind filled with numbers and acquisitions. But as he passed by the staff records board, something caught his eye. A note. Soraya Belrose. Left early. Personal emergency. He stared at it longer than necessary. She never left early. Never missed a day. Not once in 6 months. He checked the time. 2:35 p.m. She should have been folding linens on the 3rd floor. Instead, the hallway was silent. Zayden told himself not to care. It wasn't his concern. She was just an employee. But that excuse rang hollow. That night, as he sat in his office overlooking the driveway, he couldn't focus. The reports blurred in front of him. All he could think about was where she went, why she left, and why he suddenly felt like her absence had taken something from the house. He didn't see her the next morning either. But her tasks had been completed, perfectly. Someone had stepped in, yet the rooms felt emptier, colder. The toy she always moved to the shelf was untouched. The flowers were arranged, but without the color she preferred. The house ran fine, but Zayden felt off, and that's when he realized something he didn't want to admit, not even to himself. Her presence had changed something in him, and her silence, once comforting, now screamed questions he couldn't ignore. That was the night he looked out into the darkness, jaw clenched, heart unsure, and whispered to no one, "Who are you, Soraya Belrose?" And somewhere far away, in a small, quiet home at the edge of the city, a woman sat by the window, cradling a photo frame of 3 boys and humming the same melody she had sung in his mansion, never knowing the man she'd tried to forget had finally begun to remember. The silence in Zayden's office thickened as night fell, broken only by the hum of the heater and the distant patter of winter rain against the massive glass window. He stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff as stone, but his thoughts were anything but composed. Soraya Belrose had left early today, for the first time since she set foot in his mansion, and it shouldn't have meant anything to him, yet it did. It shouldn't have stirred something tight and restless in his chest, yet it had. The usual precision of his thoughts had been replaced by distraction. No matter how many spreadsheets, proposals, or pending contracts he placed in front of himself, his eyes kept drifting toward the door, as if expecting her to suddenly walk back in with her quiet eyes and steadiness. But she didn't. She wouldn't. And the fact that her absence lingered longer than her presence ever had was disorienting. He told himself it was nothing, that he was only curious. That was his mistake, allowing himself the permission to care even slightly. Because when he passed through the kitchen hours later, headed toward the espresso machine, he caught sight of something that made him stop cold. There, sitting silently on the counter next to the silver tray of untouched fruit, was her phone. Soraya's phone. She never forgot it. Ever. He stared at it like it didn't belong, like it was a ghost left behind. It was modest, covered in a soft beige case that looked slightly worn at the edges. The screen lit up with a buzz, illuminating the room with a brief glow. Without thinking, he picked it up. His fingers hovered, but he didn't unlock it. He didn't need to. The home screen, visible for a few seconds, displayed a photo. A woman and 3 little boys. In the picture, Soraya sat on a picnic blanket. A simple joy spread across her face, her long straight hair tied in a low ponytail. The boys were sprawled across her, giggling, one clinging to her neck, another waving a toy airplane in the air, and the third looking directly at the camera with the most piercing, familiar gaze. Zayden's breath caught in his throat. That face, that boy. His eyes were wide, stormy gray with specks of hazel, eyes Zayden had seen every morning in the mirror since childhood. It couldn't be, but it was. The child had his exact eyes, the same arc of lashes, the same curve of the brows. Zayden stumbled back a step, the device trembling in his hand. Triplets. They looked the same age, 4, maybe 5. The math worked. The night he couldn't forget, even when he tried to bury it beneath layers of control and ambition. The memory he thought he dreamed, a blurry, wine-stained night years ago where passion blurred into a haze, a woman with brown skin and sorrowful eyes, the scent of rain and jasmine, and a red ribbon falling onto hotel sheets. His mind reeled, his chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years, panic. Real, unfiltered panic. He set the phone down like it had burned him. His heart thundered, his pulse racing in his ears. He couldn't breathe properly. Questions rushed in, colliding in his head like a stampede. Were they his? Why didn't she say anything? Why was she working in his house? Why now? Why like this? His thoughts refused to settle, the world spinning beneath his feet. And before he could stop himself, his hand reached for the phone again, then paused. He didn't know what he'd even do with it. Call her? No, he didn't have the right. Not yet. Not with this storm in his chest. He grabbed his coat and headed out, ignoring the calls of his assistant as he stormed down the stairs. His driver opened the car door with a bow. "Where to, sir?" Zayden paused. His mind screamed one name, one answer, but he hesitated. This wasn't business. This wasn't about empire or power or deals. This was something far more delicate, far more personal, something he couldn't trust anyone else with, not even his driver. "I'll drive myself," he said quietly, taking the keys. The man blinked. "Sir?" Zayden didn't answer. He slid into the driver's seat of a sleek black Range Rover, the leather cold against his back, and pulled away from the estate without another word. The gates parted for him like obedient soldiers. Rain pelted the windshield, and for once he didn't care about visibility. He just needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. Using the last GPS location from the phone, which he'd briefly noted, he guided himself toward the city. As he drove, the streets began to shift, from marble driveways and ivy-wrapped iron fences to cracked sidewalks and rusted streetlights. He had never driven this far down into the heart of the city on his own. Not since college. Not since before he became the Zayden Carrington everyone feared in boardrooms. But tonight, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't even a man in control. He was a man chasing a ghost he never meant to haunt. He slowed near a narrow corner of Ivybrook Lane. The buildings were worn, the paint peeling from bricks, small children chasing old soccer balls in muddy puddles. A woman stood on her porch with rollers in her hair and a cigarette dangling from her mouth. Zayden parked across the street from a small, dusky blue house with a sagging porch and flower pots half full of soil. It looked tired, but there was something lovingly maintained about it. The windows were clean, the front light had a delicate butterfly cover, and the curtain in the main window had little stars stitched into the edge. He sat in silence, engine off, watching. And then he saw her. Soraya walked toward the porch from the alley, carrying a canvas grocery bag. Her coat was damp with rain, her hair slightly frizzy from the moisture. But her face was calm, gentle, peaceful in a way he'd never seen inside the mansion. She walked up the steps, and before she could even open the door fully, it burst open. 3 little boys came running out. "Mama!" they chorused in unison, voices like music, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. She laughed, the sound fuller, freer than it had ever been within his marble walls. She crouched to their level and opened her arms, receiving all 3 with ease, each boy diving into her warmth like she was a lighthouse in the storm. She dropped the bag, groceries rolling into the porch corner, and held them tightly. Zayden's hands clenched around the steering wheel. He couldn't look away. The tallest one clung to her waist. "Mama, Mama, Liam said we can't have cookies before dinner." "I did not," said the second boy, curly-haired, chubby-cheeked, voice indignant. The third one, quiet, staring straight ahead, turned suddenly and looked across the street. At Zayden, their eyes met. It was only a second, but it felt like time stopped. The boy tilted his head, his brows furrowing as if he were trying to place a memory he didn't know he had. Zayden's chest caved. It was like looking at a photograph of his younger self, every detail too precise to be coincidence. That jawline, those lashes, those eyes. Soraya, still smiling, looked down and noticed his stillness. "River?" she asked gently, stroking his curls. "Mama," he whispered, not taking his gaze off the car. "There's a man." She turned sharply. Zayden ducked quickly, heart pounding. He couldn't be seen. Not now. Not yet. He sat frozen, breath shallow, staring at the raindrops racing each other down the windshield. She didn't come closer. After a few seconds, she ushered the boys inside, scooping up the bag and gently closing the door behind them. Zayden stayed in the car long after the lights inside dimmed. The weight of truth pressed down on him like an avalanche. Those were her sons. No, his sons. Triplets. And she never told him. She raised them alone in this tiny home while working for him, and never once asked for help. His world spun. Everything he thought he controlled, his time, his emotions, his empire, was suddenly insignificant compared to what he just witnessed. He had sons, 3, and he had no idea who they were until this very moment. It wasn't just shock, it was grief, guilt, awe, a heartbreak he hadn't yet earned. As the rain slowed and the streetlights flickered above him, Xaden whispered aloud to the night, "What have I done?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and unanswered, as Xaden sat there motionless, drenched in the dim yellow hue of a cracked street lamp, his hand still gripping the cold leather steering wheel long after he'd whispered to the night, "What have I done?" But the question didn't echo back. It stayed trapped in the cabin of the car with him, suffocating, as if it were too heavy to leave. Outside, the rain that had softened into a whisper moments earlier began to fall again, slow at first, then steadily, then furiously, pelting the windshield like a heartbeat gone wild, as if the sky itself wanted to cry for what he just discovered. And Xaden, the man who was feared in boardrooms and whose name sat at the top of global wealth lists, sat frozen, feeling like a trespasser in the most intimate chapter of someone else's life, a life he may have helped create without ever realizing it. His mind replayed the scene he had just witnessed not 10 minutes ago, like a film stuck on repeat. Soraya stepping through that worn-down alleyway, grocery bag in hand, her expression open and luminous in a way it never had been at the mansion, the way the boys had run to her as if she were the very gravity that held their world together, and the way that smallest boy, River, had turned, had looked, had locked eyes with him across the street, stirring something so primal in Xaden's blood it felt like a cry from the past demanding to be heard. And now, as that porch light still glowed like a quiet guardian over the house, she called home. He remained trapped in place, afraid to move, afraid to be seen, but more afraid of what this meant for the life he thought he had built. Minutes stretched like hours, and eventually the soft click of the porch light turning off snapped him out of his daze. But only barely. The house had gone dark, all the curtains drawn, the only light remaining a small flicker in the upstairs window where one of the boys must have been tucked in for the night, perhaps clutching the same toy airplane from the photo, perhaps asking their mother for a story or a lullaby or a whispered promise that she would never leave. Xaden swallowed hard, throat dry and tight, and finally moved his hand from the wheel, pressing the pad of his thumb against the ignition button until the soft growl of the engine died, leaving the air around him disturbingly quiet, save for the rhythmic drum of rain on the roof. He could still turn back. He could drive away and pretend none of this happened, pretend the boys were not his, pretend that Soraya had never been more than a quiet maid with perfect work ethic and mysterious silences. But that was no longer possible. Not after those eyes. Not after that smile. Not after the strange ache in his chest that felt too alive to be ignored. Slowly, like a man walking through fog, he reached for the door handle and stepped out, the rain soaking through his suit in seconds, cool drops sliding down his face and disappearing into his collar. But he didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His gaze was fixed on the house across the street, that quiet, fragile little house that now held answers he didn't know he was searching for. He moved closer, step by step, his feet quiet against the slick pavement. But the moment he reached the edge of the sidewalk that framed her small gate, the porch light flicked on again, suddenly, urgently, like an alarm triggered by fate. Xaden froze. His breath hitched. Through the sheer curtain of the front window, he saw a shadow moving toward the door, and panic bolted through him like electricity. He wasn't ready. Not to face her, not to ask, not to be seen. He ducked behind the neighbor's parked truck, heart thudding like war drums in his chest, water running into his eyes. The door creaked open and Soraya stepped out again, wrapped in a gray shawl, her face turned toward the sky like she was listening to the rain. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, curling her toes against the wet wood, holding something close to her chest, one of the boy's jackets, perhaps forgotten in the evening rush. She didn't speak. She didn't call out. She simply stood there in the silence, as if sensing that something was watching her, something familiar and ghost-like on the street. Zayden's chest heaved as he gripped the fender of the truck to keep himself grounded. He watched her close her eyes and whisper something into the wind, her lips moving slowly, and he wished he knew what it was. Maybe a prayer, maybe a thought, maybe just a mother's gratitude for surviving another day. Then she turned and disappeared back into the house, the door shutting gently behind her. The light went off again, and the moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. Zayden backed away slowly, afraid even his breath might give him away, and made it back to his car, his hands trembling as he opened the door and slid in, his hair and suit drenched, his soul no longer clean. For the first time in years, the ever-confident, ruthlessly composed CEO didn't feel like himself. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel in control. He felt 17 again, nervous, young, unsure, as if he were standing outside a girl's house with flowers he wasn't brave enough to give. Only this time the girl was a woman, a mother, and the flowers were 3 sons he'd never known he had. He sat in the car, soaked, breathing in silence and all the walls he'd spent years building, walls of indifference, calculation, steel ambition, cracked under the quiet truth that he had no idea how to face her. Because he hadn't just followed his maid tonight. He had followed the fragments of a forgotten past, a past with a red ribbon and a pair of eyes that had haunted him in dreams he never talked about, a past he'd buried under titles and skyscrapers, a past that now had names, faces, laughter, love, and he didn't even know what to do with it. He stayed parked there for another hour, engine off, no plan, just 1,000 questions running in circles through his mind. Who was she before the mansion? How had she ended up in his house of all places? Had she known who he was when she took the job? Had she wanted him to find out like this? Or never at all? Did the boys know anything about him? Did they ask about their father? Did they wonder why he was never there to tuck them in, or read them bedtime stories, or chase away their nightmares with the simple promise? The thought of them growing up without his presence, without knowing their last name, carried the weight of empires, gnawed at him with an agony he didn't know how to name. But most of all, it was the memory of the gala that now took hold of his senses, flooding back in sharp colors and unspoken things. That night, 5 years ago, she had been there, not as staff, not as a stranger. She had worn a red dress, silky and elegant, a single ribbon tying her hair, a quiet smile on her face, and a mystery in her eyes that no one else in that glittering crowd had dared to carry. He hadn't known her name then. They hadn't exchanged much more than stolen glances and one night of dizzy passion. No numbers, no promises, just a fire that had burned too hot to control. And he had walked away, assuming it had ended like all his fleeting romances did. But it hadn't. That night had planted something in the world. 3 little boys now asleep under a patchwork roof, a mother still singing to them in the dark, and Zayden Carrington, drenched in rain, alone in a car, finally realizing that he had never escaped the consequences of that night. He had just delayed them. By the time he turned the ignition back on, the rain had softened to a mist, and the city lights shimmered like ghosts on the pavement. He pulled away from the curb slowly, casting one last look at the blue house with the butterfly porch light. And as he drove into the silence of the early morning, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about finding out he had children. It wasn't just about responsibility. It wasn't even just about guilt. It was about her, Soraya, the woman he had once touched with no memory of what it meant, the woman who had carried the weight of a truth that could shatter empires. And now that he had seen her fully, not just the maid, but the mother, the memory, the mystery, he couldn't unsee her. He couldn't unfeel her. And for the first time in his adult life, Zayden Carrington felt something unfamiliar crawl into his chest. Regret, yes, but also fear, because he had built a life without her in it. And now that he knew, he didn't know how to build anything that didn't start with her. The streets of the city blurred past Zayden's windshield as he drove into the early gray morning, headlights slicing through fog like quiet confessionals. But he wasn't really seeing the road. He was seeing her. Not the version of Soraya he had just witnessed in the porch light. Not the maid in a pressed uniform. Not even the mother cradling 3 small boys in her arms like she was born for love. But a younger version of her, flickering now in the softest parts of his memory, slowly coming to life as if time had just decided to unbury a night it had hidden for 5 long years. He hadn't thought of that gala in forever. Not really. He'd trained himself to dismiss it as a drunken haze, a one-time mistake born of too much wine and not enough control, the sort of story he never allowed to have power over him. But tonight, something cracked open inside him, and the fragments of that night began falling back into place, one by one, like puzzle pieces he'd been too arrogant to realize he was missing. He could see the champagne glasses glistening under the chandeliers, the soft hum of string music, and himself, Zayden Carrington, freshly victorious after closing the largest deal of his career, standing alone in the middle of a celebration that didn't feel like his. He had arrived late that night, ducking flashing cameras and swirling society gossip. A man in a midnight black suit with a tie too tight and a smile too cold, wandering through the marble halls of a charity event where everyone pretended to care about things he knew they never would. He had always hated those galas, the way the rich pretended to remember each other's names, the way beauty was currency and sincerity was a dying art. He remembered ordering scotch, but settling for wine, something dry and expensive, something he drank too fast just to fill the ache in his chest he couldn't name. That was the night his father had called him from the hospital, voice weak, telling him he was proud but wouldn't attend the wedding Zayden wasn't having. That call had gutted something inside him. He remembered walking away from the ballroom, slipping into the garden alone, stars above but no light within. And then, her. She had been standing near the rose trellis, head tilted to the sky, one red ribbon glinting in her dark, curled hair, like a flame tied with silk. He hadn't seen her before, not among the socialites, not among the waitstaff. She wasn't dressed to be noticed, yet she was the only one worth noticing. A deep burgundy gown hugged her frame, modest but magnetic, and when she turned, her eyes met his like they already knew each other. She smiled, not the kind women gave him because of his bank account, but something gentler, something sad. She hadn't spoken first, neither had he, but something passed between them in that silence. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just mutual weariness. It had started simply. She asked if he was okay. He replied with a lie. She caught it with a laugh. They talked about nothing and everything. She didn't fawn. She didn't flatter. She listened, challenged. She asked questions he wasn't used to answering. "What are you running from?" she had asked, legs tucked beneath her on the stone bench, her heels discarded in the grass. He had told her about the deal, about the power, about how success felt like drowning in gold. She had nodded, not impressed, but understanding. Lonely at the top, she teased softly. He had laughed bitterly. Lonely everywhere. And then she'd reached for his hand. Just like that. No fanfare, no flirtation, just a hand holding his like it belonged there. He remembered how small it felt in his palm, how warm. They wandered the garden paths together, sharing pieces of themselves in soft-spoken admissions and laughter laced with regret. And then the rain came, light and sudden, and she danced in it, eyes closed, ribbons soaked, spinning slowly in the moonlight while he stood frozen, watching her with the sort of awe he hadn't felt since he was a boy. "You don't dance?" she had asked, smiling at him through wet lashes. "Only in dreams," he murmured. "Then dream with me." So he did. They ended up at the hotel nearby, not by plan but by instinct, hearts heavy with unspoken things. In the elevator, their fingers had brushed. On the rooftop, he kissed her for the first time, desperate, searching, breathless. And then passion took over. Not lust, but something deeper, slower. He remembered the soft gasp she made when he first undid the ribbon, the way her eyes never looked away, the way her body curved into his like it had always known the shape of him. He remembered whispers, names they never exchanged, fears they did. Her voice trembling as she confessed she'd never done anything this reckless. His voice quieter, saying maybe reckless was exactly what they both needed. They had made love in the dim warmth of a hotel suite that smelled of jasmine and wet roses, with thunder far in the distance, and city lights bleeding through the windows like blessings neither of them felt worthy of. No promises, no morning after plans, just sleep tangled in sweat and skin, his arm wrapped around her waist like a silent vow, even if neither of them dared to speak it. But when he woke, she was gone. The ribbon was folded on the pillow beside him. The bed was cold, no name, no note, just the memory. And over time he convinced himself it had been a fantasy, some stranger he'd never find again, a moment carved from loneliness, not fate. He buried it. He buried her. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He drowned it in work, in control, in carefully curated days and boardrooms where feelings had no place. But now that he had seen her face again, now that the boy's laughter rang in his ears like echoes of that long-forgotten night, he realized what a lie that had been. It had meant everything, and he had let it slip through his fingers. She had loved him once, maybe not in the way lovers speak of love, but in the way her silence wrapped around his storm, in the way her touch steadied his spiraling world. And now she was here. Soraya, the girl with the ribbon, the woman with his sons, the stranger who had never really been a stranger at all. Zayden pulled into his penthouse garage and sat in the car, letting the engine idle until the growl turned to silence. His reflection stared back at him in the windshield, and for the first time he didn't recognize the man looking back. He wasn't the CEO tonight. He wasn't the billionaire. He was just a man who had lost something before he even realized he had it, and now fate had circled back, demanding he face the truth. The red ribbon was gone, but the thread it had tied through his life had never really unraveled. It had just waited, quiet and coiled, beneath the noise of everything he thought he wanted. And now he had to ask himself the hardest question of all. Was he brave enough to find out who she had become? And would she ever forgive him for forgetting who she was? The sky outside the Carrington mansion was awash in gold and pale blue when the first light of morning slid through the enormous windows and spilled across the polished kitchen tiles, illuminating the quiet space where Zayden stood like a man made of stone and heartbreak, the weight of the previous night still coiled tight in his chest, like a truth too heavy to name, and yet one that demanded to be faced. He hadn't slept, not even closed his eyes. Instead, he'd spent the night pacing through empty rooms that once felt like a kingdom and now felt like a fortress of loneliness, his footsteps echoing off marbled silence while he replayed her face, the boy's laughter, the way River had looked at him across that rain-drenched street with eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly it shattered the barrier between denial and reality. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there by the kitchen island, the pale gray countertop beneath his palms cold and unyielding, his fingers drumming softly beside the object that now held the thread between his past and his present. Soraya's phone, the simple, unassuming device that had detonated his illusions and reminded him, with undeniable clarity, that the woman he had once touched under a blanket of stars and stormy skies had not only remembered him, but carried pieces of him within her for 5 years, in the form of 3 living, breathing children who had grown up laughing without his voice, crying without his comfort, and dreaming without his name. The soft chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway marked 7 a.m., but time had no meaning anymore, not when every second he'd lost now rang louder than the empires he'd spent a lifetime building. He heard her footsteps before he saw her, light and careful, her rhythm always deliberate like a woman who had learned how to walk in silence to avoid drawing attention to herself. And though he had heard her enter this kitchen hundreds of times before, always early, always graceful, this time was different, because this time she was walking straight toward the storm she didn't know was waiting. When Soraya stepped into the room, her presence pulled something in him taut. She was dressed as always in her simple uniform, her hair pulled back with quiet elegance, her hands at her sides. But the second her eyes landed on the phone on the counter, the calm in her posture cracked, a flicker of fear and recognition blooming behind those wide, soulful eyes that had once looked up at him in the dark with a trust so fragile it haunted him now. Xaden didn't speak right away. He watched her the way a man watches the only light left in a collapsing tunnel, the way someone watches something precious they don't know how to hold anymore. Her breath caught in her throat, and when she took a small step forward, he could see it in every inch of her being. She knew exactly why he was standing there, and yet she held herself with the same quiet dignity that had drawn him to her without knowing it, long before this morning ever came. He picked up the phone with slow precision and slid it gently across the counter toward her, the screen dark now, but the image of her on that picnic blanket with those boys was seared into his memory like a scar that would never heal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, raw, and softer than she'd ever heard it. Not the voice of a CEO used to commanding boardrooms, but a man unraveling from the inside out as he uttered, "Cute boys." And though the words were simple, the weight behind them made the air between them crackle with the unbearable tension of 5 years' worth of silence. Her lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came out at first, only the trembling of her fingers as she reached for the phone and held it to her chest like a lifeline that could protect her from everything he might say next. But it couldn't, and they both knew it. Xaden stepped around the island slowly, not to corner her, but to close the distance between them. Not physically, but emotionally, because there was too much between them now to pretend this was just about a phone. And when he came to a stop just a few feet from her, he asked the question that had haunted him all night, the one that had driven him through rain and memory and regret. "Are they mine?" And the moment the words left his mouth, he felt like the floor beneath them shifted, like the entire world narrowed to that one breathless question, and the answer she hadn't yet spoken but already wore across her trembling mouth and tear-glossed eyes. Soraya's face crumpled not in weakness, but in the unbearable strength it took to finally acknowledge the truth she had carried alone for so long. Her chin quivering as she blinked hard and forced herself to look up into the eyes of the man who had once touched her heart beneath a sky full of stars and then disappeared into a world she could never reach. And when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break him. "Why now?" she asked, and those 2 words weren't just about timing. They were a mother's cry, a woman's heartbreak. A question steeped in nights spent rocking babies alone, in birthdays sung with no one to share the candles, in lies told gently to 3 growing boys who asked where their father was and received only half-truths in return. He stepped closer, not out of obligation, but because something in her sorrow called to him like nothing else ever had. and when he answered, his voice was filled with more ache than he had ever allowed himself to feel. "Because I didn't know I was sleeping through the best years of my life," he said, and his confession hung between them like the apology he didn't know how to make. She turned then, her movement sudden, like a bird startled mid-flight, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to step away, to retreat before the pain collapsed her entirely. But he reached out and caught her hand. Not forcefully, not with entitlement, but with reverence, with a desperation that trembled in his fingers as they wrapped gently around hers, grounding her and him both in a moment too sacred to break. "Please," he said, his voice cracking like the first split in glass before it shatters completely. "Just tell me." Her eyes welled again, not with shame, not with fear, but with the exhaustion of a woman who had held a truth too heavy for too long. And when she nodded slowly, her chin dipping toward her chest, before she looked up at him and gave the answer that changed everything, her voice shaking as it carried the words he had both feared and needed to hear. "Yes, Xaden," she whispered through a breath that trembled like autumn leaves in wind. "They're yours." And with those two words, the world he had known ceased to exist, and something entirely new and terrifying and beautiful began to unfold between them in the space of a single, irreversible truth. The weight of her words, "They're yours," still echoed in the cavern of Xaden's chest when Soraya slowly pulled her hand from his, the truth having now bloomed like a bruise between them, beautiful and painful all at once, and he stood there, unmoving, his breath lodged halfway between shock and something far more shattering, something like guilt that came too late to feel noble. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The only sound in the Grand Carrington kitchen was the distant humming of the refrigerator and the dull tick of the antique wall clock, marking the seconds that seemed heavier now than the years they'd lost. Soraya looked down at the floor as if searching for the strength to lift her head again, and when she finally spoke, her voice was different, not whispery or broken like before, but low and raw, as if scraped against too many nights of silence and swallowed tears, her confession pouring out in fragments as her eyes glossed with unshed sorrow. "I tried," she said, her fingers twisting around the phone she'd just reclaimed, holding it like a lifeline and a weapon all at once. "I called your office twice. I emailed your company more than once. I showed up to your building with a letter, and they told me I was just another girl chasing a rich man's wallet. They said they knew my type, told me to leave before security made me. One of them even laughed." Her voice trembled slightly now, not from fear, but fury. Fury that had been buried for years, fury she had learned to silence because rage took energy, and energy was something she'd had to ration between bottles, bedtime stories, and budget grocery lists. Xaden's heart thudded in his chest like a prisoner trying to escape its cell as he listened, each sentence another chisel breaking through the pedestal of power he'd spent his entire life building. And suddenly it all felt grotesque. His name, his empire, the fortress he thought he'd built to protect himself, now revealed as the very wall that had kept her locked out, not because she didn't try, but because he had made himself unreachable. "They never told me," he whispered, his voice strangled by shame. "They never said anything." But even as he spoke, he could see the bitter irony of it all. He was so insulated by power, by status, by the invisible moat that surrounded billionaires, that even a woman carrying his children couldn't get close enough to be heard. "I would have come," he said, stepping forward again, aching to erase the distance between them. "I would have—" "You think I don't know that?" She cut in softly, not with anger but exhaustion, her arms wrapping around herself as if she were holding in everything that had nearly broken her over the past 5 years. "I believed you would too. That's why I tried. But the higher you build your tower, Xaden, the harder it is for people like me to reach you. And I got tired. I was pregnant, alone, scared. I couldn't chase someone who didn't even know I existed beyond one night. He wanted to reach for her then, not just physically, but in every way a man reaches when he knows he's failed, something sacred. When he knows he's missed the miracle blooming just outside the window while he was staring at spreadsheets and stock numbers. But he didn't move because her eyes were sharp now, not unkind but clear, eyes that had long since stopped waiting for him. "You should have found me," he said again, softer this time. Not as a defense, but as a plea for some explanation he still hoped could rewrite the heartbreak of absence. But her response came without hesitation, and with the brutal grace only a woman who had survived could offer. "I did," she said, her voice like silk cutting through bone. "You were too powerful to touch." And with that single line she undid him, every last thread of his certainty, his sense of control, his illusion that he was a man who could manage everything, because in that one sentence he saw the truth. He had mistaken success for reach, control for compassion, and in doing so he had allowed the one connection that might have grounded him to be silenced by bureaucracy, arrogance, and the armor of privilege he hadn't realized had kept not just enemies out, but love too. Xaden felt it then, the collapse, not of his reputation, not of his image, but of the man he thought he was. Because in front of Soraya, he wasn't the CEO of Carrington International or the billionaire Forbes wrote about every quarter. He was just a man who had missed the first steps, the first words, the birthdays, the bedtime stories, the skinned knees and nightlight. Fears of three boys who carried his blood but not his memories. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice hoarse, his eyes burning not from pride but from the unbearable ache of truth. "Not as the man with all the money or all the buildings. I'm sorry as the man who didn't know, who should have known, who should have broken every wall down to find you, even if I didn't remember your name. I should have tried harder. I should have been there." But apologies, no matter how sincere, were not keys that unlocked forgiveness. And Soraya looked at him then with eyes full of all the storms she had weathered without him, her lips trembling not from weakness, but from the strength it took to say what she said next. "Being a father takes more than regret, Xaden," she said, and each word was a slow blade, not meant to wound, but to carve out space between what had been and what might still be. Because forgiveness wasn't something you earned in a kitchen with tears and revelations. It was something you built over time, with effort, with consistency, with proof that you understood what was lost and were willing to do the work to never lose it again. And with that she turned away, not dramatically, not with cruelty, but with the quiet finality of someone who had learned long ago that walking away didn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it meant choosing yourself, choosing your children, choosing to let the past breathe before trying to resuscitate it. Xaden didn't call after her. He didn't chase. He stood there, surrounded by granite and glass, and the echo of a life he had built with perfect symmetry and stunning isolation, now cracked open by a truth far more powerful than profit. He had been found by the woman he lost, and by the children he never knew he had, and now he had to figure out who he was without the illusion of control, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a deal, a number, or a legacy. He was chasing the pieces of his heart that had been walking around outside his body for 5 years without him even knowing. The air in Xaden's lungs had never felt heavier than it did after Soraya walked away from him, her final words still echoing in the silence of his kitchen, haunting and sacred all at once, words that etched a permanent scar into the man who had once believed power made him invincible, only to find that the soft refusal of a woman carrying his legacy could dismantle him more thoroughly than any hostile takeover ever could. And that night he didn't return to his penthouse or his desk or the comfort of his corner office. He stayed in the guest quarters of the mansion, sitting by the window in a suit he never changed out of, watching the city lights shimmer like 1,000 regrets blinking at him through the night sky, his mind spiraling with images of 3 small boys and a woman who had carried them without complaint, without support, without him, and the pain of realizing he'd missed Cairo's first steps, River's first word, Liam's first scraped knee felt like a hole in his chest that no apology could fill. Morning didn't offer relief, only purpose, and by sunrise he found himself in his garage with keys in hand, bypassing his usual driver and the fleet of luxury vehicles, instead choosing the nondescript black SUV that had become his choice in recent days, the same one he had followed her in, the same one that now seemed to know the roads to her world better than he did. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. This wasn't about business. This wasn't about damage control. This was about showing up, not with words or flowers or financial promises, but with his presence, raw and unprepared, in the lives he had unknowingly helped create. He found the school with more difficulty than expected, tucked into a corner of the city where playground fences were rusted, paint peeled from the brick walls, and laughter still rang loud despite the lack of polish. It was the kind of place he'd never set foot in during his youth. But now, as he parked across the street and shut off the engine, it felt more sacred than any boardroom. The schoolyard was fenced in with a wide metal gate and a patchy soccer field at the back, where children were just beginning to trickle out, backpacks bouncing against tiny shoulders, shouts of joy and farewell mingling in the air as parents gathered outside the gate. Zayden didn't exit the car at first. He stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline, his heart pounding not from fear of confrontation, but from the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could glimpse the parts of himself he had never met, the 3 boys who shared his DNA but none of his memories. The dismissal bell rang high and shrill, and the school doors opened like a floodgate, releasing children in clusters, some running, some dragging their feet, and in the middle of that swarm he saw them, 3 small figures moving together like a unit, a galaxy of their own, their laughter rising above the others, indistinguishable at first, until one of them, the boy with the calmest gaze, turned toward the gate and Zayden's breath caught in his throat like a punch he hadn't braced for. Cairo, River, and Liam walked together, their backpacks nearly swallowing their tiny frames, their energy contagious even from across the street. And as they stepped off the sidewalk, Cairo suddenly tripped over a shoelace, his knee buckling mid-run, and Zayden moved before he thought, his instincts leaping faster than logic, his feet hitting the ground as he crossed the street and knelt down just in time to catch the boy before his chin hit pavement, the soft thud of the impact resonating through his arms as he cradled Cairo upright. "Whoa there," Zayden said, his voice a mix of worry and wonder, and Cairo blinked up at him, momentarily stunned before breaking into a grin that nearly undid every piece of Zayden's already shredded heart. "Thanks, mister," Cairo chirped, brushing off his pants, and by then River and Liam had run back to surround them, their identical curls bouncing as they looked curiously at the man kneeling before their brother. Liam squinted at him, tilting his head with narrowed eyes that mirrored the skepticism Zayden had seen in so many executives across his life, but coming from a 5-year-old made it almost endearing. "You look like someone," Liam said, his tone thoughtful, and Zayden smiled softly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that hadn't happened in weeks. "Maybe someone in one of your mom's old photos," he offered gently, testing the waters, and all 3 boys looked at one another before River, the quietest one, asked, "You knew, Mama?" Zayden felt the question pierce something inside him, not with pain, but with a fragile kind of joy, the kind that trembled when you realized you were standing at the doorway of something precious, something that could either welcome you or shut you out completely. He nodded, still kneeling. "I loved her," he said, his voice steady even though his heart was not. "Before I even knew her name." The words came from a place so deep inside him that he didn't question their vulnerability. It was the truest thing he had ever spoken. The boys exchanged glances again, their expressions unreadable, and then Cairo broke into a grin. "Want to play soccer?" he asked, lifting a foam ball from his backpack, and Zayden let out a stunned laugh, the kind that caught him off guard, full and real, and echoing louder in his own chest than in the air. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." And so on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in slacks and a cashmere coat that now felt far too stiff for the role he was trying to step into, Zayden Carrington, billionaire, tycoon, man once untouched by fatherhood, found himself on a ragged schoolyard field, playing soccer with three little boys who called each other brother and didn't yet understand why he looked at them like they were made of stardust. He ran, kicked, laughed. He fell once and landed in mud, making Cairo burst into such loud laughter he nearly dropped the ball. And for the first time in 5 years, Zayden felt human in a way no award, no contract, no title had ever made him feel. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and shadows stretched long across the field, the boys crowded around him, limbs tangled, arms thrown over his shoulders, their cheeks flushed with joy and their eyes alight with the kind of warmth he had only ever dreamed of. Then a new shadow fell across the sidewalk. Soraya had arrived. She stood frozen at the edge of the playground, keys still in hand, her grocery bag slung over one shoulder, and her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and something softer, something she didn't know whether to name hope or heartbreak. Her gaze landed on Zayden, crouched in the grass with her sons climbing over him like a human jungle gym, his coat dirtied, his smile unguarded, and her heart stuttered. She didn't speak. Not yet. She just watched, unsure whether to cry or smile or run, but in that stillness, something undeniable bloomed between them. Maybe he hadn't known how to find her back then, but today he had found their sons. Soraya stood quietly beside the school's side entrance, still holding her keys, her knuckles white against the plastic grocery bag strap, watching Zayden laugh as her three sons clung to him like he was made of sunlight. And for several long seconds she couldn't move, not because she didn't want to, but because the image in front of her seemed like something pulled from a forgotten dream, the kind that felt too soft to be real and too beautiful to be trusted. And yet there he was, knee-deep in mud and childhood joy, hair wind-blown and tie undone, not as the CEO who ruled cities with his signature, but as a man who had finally stepped down from the clouds to kneel on a playground. And in that moment, something inside her cracked, not entirely open, but enough to let breath in, and when he turned and saw her, their eyes met with a quiet thud that made the boys pause, sensing the shift in the air. Zayden didn't stand right away. Instead, he stayed where he was, with Liam perched on his back, River at his side, and Cairo holding one of his hands like it belonged to him now. And Soraya, unsure of how to respond to the rush in her chest, simply gave a small nod and turned toward the parking lot, signaling the boys with her eyes that it was time to go home. That evening passed like a whisper, but it was only the beginning, because the next day and the one after that, Zayden began showing up without warning, not loud or demanding, but present in a way that made it impossible to ignore how much he had changed, or maybe how much of him had always been hidden beneath ambition, waiting to be called forward by something more powerful than wealth. He didn't knock on her door every morning, didn't beg for forgiveness in grand gestures or expensive gifts. He simply learned the boys' school schedule, showed up at Cairo's allergy appointment with a peanut-free snack tucked into his coat pocket, brought 3 identical backpacks to replace their worn ones after noticing a broken strap, and stood in the back row of the school auditorium during their winter play, dressed in black so as not to distract, yet glowing with pride when River stepped onto the stage in cardboard wings, playing the quiet angel who guides the lost child home. He clapped too loud, and Soraya turned in her seat with wide eyes, and he only offered an apologetic smile, the kind that made her chest ache because it wasn't the grin of a billionaire. It was the nervous beam of a man who just wanted to make his children proud. The boys, especially Cairo, took to him like roots finding water. At first they called him Z like it was a code, then Uncle Z when he showed up with superhero socks for all three of them on a rainy Tuesday. And by the third week, Zayden found his name written in crayon on a drawing pinned to the fridge. 4 stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun, and his heart twisted when he realized River had drawn it. But it wasn't the title that mattered to him anymore. It was the way they looked for him at the end of each school day, the way they began saving questions about dinosaurs and planets just for him, the way they waited until he arrived to open their juice boxes because they knew he'd make some joke about fruit armies attacking. One night, after soccer practice, as Zayden knelt to tie Liam's shoe, River, always the quietest, walked up to him holding a piece of gum and asked in the most casual tone, "Are you gonna marry Mama?" And the question hit Zayden harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had, but he didn't flinch. He looked up, right into the boy's wide eyes, and answered with a voice steady but tender, "If she'll have me." River stared for a second longer, then nodded solemnly as if conducting a final review, and handed him the gum like an offering of approval. Soraya had overheard from a few feet away, and when Zayden turned, she was already looking away, cheeks tinted with a blush that had nothing to do with embarrassment, and everything to do with the sudden storm of emotion she didn't know how to name. She hadn't planned for this. She had barely allowed herself to imagine it. This version of Zayden, softer, quieter, still brilliant, but no longer hiding behind the armor of untouchable success. He didn't try to bulldoze his way into her world. He built himself a place slowly, brick by brick, act by act, until she couldn't deny the shift. At night, she found herself reaching for her journal again, writing not about loneliness or tiredness, but small things. How Zayden remembered which twin liked green apples and which liked red. How he fixed the leak in her bathroom without asking. How he sat outside in the hallway until Cairo's fever broke just so he could say he was close. Still, her heart was cautious. The scars weren't shallow, and trust wasn't a switch that could be flipped just because a man changed his suit for sneakers and started bringing bedtime stories. She'd loved him once when he was a stranger with a red ribbon in his hand and a sadness in his eyes. And that love had bloomed in the dark, only to be left without light. Now, watching him become not just a visitor, but a presence in their everyday, she wondered if the man she had once touched beneath moonlight was still there, or if he had been reborn entirely into someone new. Yet the way he looked at the boys, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, it chipped away at her defenses, bit by bit, like time carving rivers into stone, not with force but with patience. And maybe, just maybe, the parts of him she once fell for were still flickering beneath the surface, waiting for her forgiveness, not as a prize, but as a path forward. Soraya had barely slept that week, the days blurring into evenings, the evenings into silence, all of it filled with the exhausting rhythm of uncertainty that came with letting someone back into your life who once left without knowing what they lost. And yet Zayden's presence had shifted her universe in small, undeniable ways. Ways she tried to ignore but couldn't. Not when her suns glowed at the sound of his footsteps. Not when her fingers trembled around coffee mugs after he'd touched her hand accidentally while helping slice apples for Cairo's school snack. And on the night the storm came crashing in, she found herself standing beneath the flickering hallway bulb of their small house, watching water drip from the ceiling like sorrow returning through the roof she could no longer protect, because the wind outside howled like a wounded beast, and thunder cracked above their heads like a warning bell, ringing through every forgotten promise. It had started as a whisper of rain in the afternoon, turning quickly into something feral. Winds clawing at windows, trees bending low in morning, and then, as if the heavens themselves had split open, water came in from everywhere, through the roof, through the corners of windows, seeping across her floors like liquid regret. Soraya panicked, grabbing towels, moving her boys into the smallest, driest corner of the house she could find, wrapping them in blankets and whispering soothing stories, with her voice breaking while inside her chest a scream was building, not because of the storm, but because she had run out of ways to protect them on her own. Then came the headlights through the fogged glass, bright and too still to be lightning, and a knock at the door she hadn't expected, not because she didn't think he'd come, but because she hadn't called. She opened the door with trembling fingers, rain sweeping sideways into her face, and there he was, Zayden, soaked through, breathless, standing like a lighthouse in the chaos, his coat dripping, his tie forgotten, eyes locked on hers like she was the only thing that anchored him in the world. "Get your things," he said, no hesitation, no questions, just that voice, steady, firm, the voice of someone who was no longer trying to make up for lost time with apologies, but with action. She blinked, frozen. "You... how did you—" "I knew the storm would hit hard," he cut in gently, stepping past the threshold and scooping Cairo into his arms while the boy sleepily clung to his shoulder. "I checked the weather. I checked your neighborhood. I didn't wait for your call this time. I'm not waiting anymore, Soraya." The words hit her harder than the wind. He gathered all three boys in blankets, ushered them into the SUV parked out front, then turned to her, held out his hand, not commanding, but offering. "Come with me," he said softly, like a promise layered into the rain. And she did. She didn't argue. She didn't question. She stepped forward, her hand slipping into his, and he lifted her, not because she couldn't walk, but because something about the gesture felt like protection itself, and carried her to the car as the storm roared around them, the wind chasing their past down the street like it had finally been released from all the years of silence. Back at his estate, the boys were settled into the guest wing by a housekeeper Zayden had already instructed to prepare warm baths and soup, and Soraya stood in the grand living room wrapped in a robe, her wet clothes folded beside the fire, her curls half damp and her fingers curled around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, staring into the flames like they might explain how this man who had once vanished without memory, was now standing beside her in bare feet and rolled-up sleeves, watching her with eyes that didn't carry arrogance anymore, but reverence. "Thank you," she said finally, voice small but sure, and he stepped closer, not looming, not intruding, but gently entering the space between her solitude and her longing. "I didn't know," he whispered. "All these years I didn't know what I'd lost, and now that I see it, I can't unsee it." She didn't move. The silence stretched, broken only by the snap of logs in the fire. He set his tea down and knelt before her, not as a king, but as a man stripped of everything but truth, and reached for her hand with hesitation that trembled beneath confidence. "I don't want to miss another second," he said, his fingers folding around hers. "I know I can't change the years, but I want to be there for every year ahead, for them, for you, even if it takes the rest of my life to prove I'm worthy." She looked down at him, her throat tight, her heart pounding in uneven beats that echoed all the way back to the night 5 years ago when he had kissed her beneath stars and jasmine air and promised to remember a night he never did. Tears shimmered in her eyes, too full of memory to fall. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, each syllable a confession ripped from the roots of her soul. "I just stopped believing you'd remember me." And then something shifted. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply, achingly real. Zayden rose slowly, cupping her cheek with his hand, brushing away the rainwater that had dried there hours ago, but still lingered like ghosts. And then his lips met hers, not with hunger but with reverence, slow and quiet and full of everything they had never said, everything they had lost, and everything they still had time to build. It wasn't a kiss for the past, it was a kiss for every tomorrow. And she let him in. Finally. The night after the storm passed left behind more than soaked clothes and flickering candlelight. It left behind clarity, soft and undeniable, the kind that crept in after truths were finally spoken, and kisses stitched up years of silence. Zayden didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't restlessness that kept him awake. It was the presence of peace, finally earned, lying just a few rooms away with his 3 sons breathing in sync, and the woman he once forgot now carved into every corner of his soul. As morning stretched across the sky in golden streaks, warming the windows of a house that had always echoed with silence, Zayden stood at the threshold of a decision he hadn't rushed toward, but now could no longer delay. It wasn't about redemption. It wasn't even about time lost. It was about choosing them, fully, permanently, without any backup plan or hesitation. He called the boys into the sunroom after breakfast, crouching beside them on the plush carpet as sunlight danced across their curls. "I need your help with something important," he said, tone lowered to match the gravity he knew they wouldn't yet understand, but would feel anyway. Liam leaned forward, nose wrinkled. "Is it a secret mission?" Cairo bounced. "Will it have cake?" River just watched him with quiet curiosity, sensing the undercurrent. Zayden smiled. "Better. I want to ask your mama a very big question, but I want all 3 of you to be part of it." He handed each of them a little drawing pad and a set of colored markers. "I need you to make signs. Really special signs." He explained the plan slowly, carefully, letting them feel the weight of the moment. And when he finished, River, who rarely spoke unless it mattered, asked, "Does that mean you'll stay forever?" Zayden didn't blink. He nodded. "Yes, if she'll have me, I'll stay forever. With all of you." Liam gave a whoop. Cairo launched into drawing stick figures, and River picked up a green marker and started writing with precise care. While they worked, Zayden slipped away, heart pounding with a kind of excitement he hadn't felt since his earliest business ventures, the kind of hope that couldn't be bought, only built. He drove them all, later that afternoon, to a jeweler far from the city, somewhere quiet, personal, the kind of place where rings weren't just metal and stones, but stories frozen in gold. He knelt with each boy as they pointed and debated. Liam wanted the biggest, Cairo the shiniest, River the simplest. In the end, it was River's quiet pick they agreed on, a slender band rose gold with a marquise-cut diamond set like a flame in the center. It looked like something Soraya would never ask for but secretly love. They returned before sunset, excitement bubbling beneath the surface of the mansion's quiet elegance. Zayden spent the next hour stringing fairy lights across the backyard with help from Cairo and Liam, who tangled themselves more than the wires, while River carefully taped the finished signs to popsicle sticks. "Say yes, Mommy," they read in bold, bright letters, each word written in a different boy's handwriting, slightly crooked, beautifully imperfect. When the sky turned dusky and the air cooled just enough to make Soraya reach for a shawl, Zayden called her to the back patio, claiming the boys had something to show her. She stepped out cautiously, wary but curious, and then froze. The backyard glowed. Strings of lights looped through the branches, a path of petals leading toward the fire pit, now circled with lanterns, and at the center stood her sons, each holding a sign, grinning so hard their cheeks hurt. Her hand flew to her mouth, and before she could speak, Zayden appeared behind them, dropping slowly to one knee on the soft grass. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't need one. In a simple black shirt and jeans, eyes shining, hair kissed by the wind, he looked more regal than he ever had behind a marble desk. He held the box in one hand, the ring catching the light like a promise caught mid-breath, and his voice, so often sharp and commanding, was now soft, reverent. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed. 3 sons, a second chance, and a love that never really left. Let me give you forever." The words hit her like thunder beneath her ribs. Saraya gasped, not because she hadn't dreamed of this moment in some far-off, broken place in her mind, but because it was real, and it was now, and it was everything she had once buried in silence. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the grass with him, her hands shaking, eyes blurring. "You're everything I never let myself dream of," she whispered, the tears falling before she could stop them, falling not in sadness but in the kind of joy that comes only after great sorrow. She touched the ring, but her eyes never left his. "You gave me sons. Let me give you forever." She nodded, the motion more powerful than 1,000 yeses, and the boys screamed with glee, throwing their signs into the air and launching themselves at both parents, tackling them into a pile of laughter and grass-stained joy, a heap of limbs and giggles, and the kind of love that had taken years to bloom, but now covered everything like spring after a long winter. That night, Zayden tucked each boy into bed himself, reading them stories, kissing their foreheads, listening as River asked, "Will you be here in the morning?" and answering with a simple, sure, "Everyone." Then he returned to the master suite, where Saraya waited beneath the soft lamplight in his bed, now their bed, and when he crawled in beside her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his lips into the hollow of her shoulder, she whispered, "You're home now." And for the first time in years, his mansion wasn't cold or hollow or lonely. It wasn't just a house, it was full. The morning of their wedding dawned not with grandiosity, but with a softness that felt like a blessing. Sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains, the distant cooing of birds weaving into the breeze, and the quiet giggles of 3 boys running barefoot through Zayden's mansion halls, as if joy were their only language. The estate had been transformed, not by a wedding planner with a catalogue of luxury, but by intention, by love, by the hands of people who had built something sacred over months of trust and forgiveness. The garden where Zayden once walked alone in silence now bloomed with rows of jasmine, white roses, and flickers of lavender lining the stone path, their fragrance caught on the wind like the memory of a promise. Saraya stood before a full-length mirror in the guest suite that morning, surrounded by soft laughter, her long brown skin glowing against the silk-white gown that fit like poetry, her curls pinned with white lilies and flecks of baby's breath, a crown of softness instead of diamonds. Her heart beat steady, not with nerves, but with the knowledge that this wasn't just a wedding. It was the return of something she'd thought the world had stolen from her. Joy that didn't need explanation. The boys, dressed in miniature tuxedos with mismatched socks because Cairo insisted stripes were lucky, danced around her with uncontainable excitement, each of them assigned a task more important than gold. River carried the ring, Liam held her bouquet, and Cairo had sworn himself guardian of her veil, his small hands gripping the fabric like a knight guarding a treasure. Outside, guests gathered beneath the shade of willow trees, soft string music floating from a quartet set beneath a pergola wrapped in wild vines. Zayden stood near the altar, a man who once terrified boardrooms now undone by emotion, unable to control the way his breath caught every time someone mentioned her name. He wore no tie, his shirt open at the collar, but a small white flower was pinned just over his heart, a flower Saraya's sons had picked and insisted he wear. As the music shifted, everyone turned, and time itself seemed to pause as Saraya appeared at the edge of the garden, framed in sunlight, her sons flanking her, each holding part of her veil like 3 little anchors, guiding her to the man waiting at the end of the aisle. The guests didn't breathe. didn't blink, because there she was, not just a bride, but a mother, a survivor, a woman whose love had transcended pain, standing in a garden where silence once ruled, and now joy reigned. Zayden's hands trembled. He didn't blink as she walked toward him, because he never wanted to forget a single second. And when she reached him, he didn't say, "You look beautiful," or "Thank you for coming." Instead, he took her hand, pressed his lips to her knuckles, and whispered through tears, "You didn't just give me sons. You gave me a soul." They said their vows with no scripts, no rehearsals, just words pulled from the marrow of their lives. Soraya promised not perfection, but presence. Zayden vowed not redemption, but partnership. And when the officiant asked who gave this woman away, Cairo piped up proudly, "We all do." And the garden erupted in laughter and tears that blurred into the wind like confetti. They kissed not for the cameras, but for the memories, the kind of kiss that sealed wounds, not just promises. Their first dance took place on a circular lawn, lit with soft lanterns, Zayden holding her waist like it was sacred ground, Soraya's head resting against his shoulder as they moved slowly, swaying to the kind of music that doesn't need lyrics to speak. Halfway through, the triplets ran in, each demanding a turn, and the crowd clapped and laughed as Zayden spun Cairo gently, then lifted Liam like an airplane, then bowed to River, letting him lead. It wasn't choreographed, it was chaotic, beautiful, messy love in its most honest form. One guest was overheard whispering, "This isn't a wedding, it's a home being built in real time." That night, they cut cake under fairy lights, toasted with sparkling cider because the boys insisted champagne smelled funny, and Zayden made a speech with one arm wrapped around Soraya's waist and the other holding Liam, his voice cracking as he said, "My whole life I chased empires. Then love walked into my mansion, disguised as a maid, and turned me into a man." Later, after the guests had gone and the laughter had settled into warm echoes through the halls, Zayden and Soraya stood beneath the stars on the balcony, overlooking their now forever home. She leaned into his chest, their bodies warm despite the breeze, his hand stroking her back like it was a map he'd memorized. The boys were asleep upstairs, curled into a single bed by choice, their new bedtime ritual involving whispered stories, and a father who now never missed a night. Zayden looked up at the sky, stars scattered across the velvet black, like the dreams he never thought he'd deserve. And he whispered, not into her ear, but into the space between them where truth now lived freely. "I was lost in riches, and you made me rich in love." Soraya closed her eyes at that, a smile softening her mouth, her heart, her every ache. "I never needed a ring," she whispered back, "just the man you became." He held her tighter. The night was still. No more storms, no more silence. Just breathe. Just peace. She knew in that moment, as his heartbeat steadied beneath her cheek and the scent of jasmine wafted from the garden below, that this love, the one born of misunderstanding, of time missed, of children never meant to be hidden, was the strongest kind, because it had been written in silence, rewritten in truth, and sealed not by fate, but by choice. Their choice, every single day forward.